Exercise 11.2.
Listen to a discussion in a U.S. history class.
Morning, everyone. We've been discussing the Civil War for the last couple of weeks, talking about some of the major battles of the war. So today I've invited a guest to come to our class. I'd like all of you to meet Ms. Frances Adams. She's the state coordinator of the Civil War Heritage Society, which is involved in preserving battlefields all over the eastern part of the country. Ms. Adams?
Thank you, Professor Nugent. Thanks for inviting me. I always appreciate the chance to talk to students, to anyone who'll listen for that matter, about our disappearing battlefields. The organization I work with is trying to save battlefields from development. It's an uphill struggle. By one estimate, 25 acres of Civil War battlefield are being lost every day. That's like an acre an hour. In fact, we're trying to save one battlefield right here in our state. You may have read about it in the newspapers. There's a site, only about 100 miles from here, called Ivy Station, where a small battle was fought in the closing days of the war in 1864. A development company wants to build a 300-unit apartment complex where that battle was fought, and we, the society that is, we're trying to stop them.
Ms. Adams, I always assumed, that battlefields are protected by the government. A few years ago, I went with my family to the battlefield at Gettysburg, and it seemed pretty well protected to me.
You're right. The Gettysburg battlefield is well protected. After all, Gettysburg was the largest battle of the whole war. And so, the sites of most important battles, Gettysburg, Antietam, Shiloh, Vicksburg, they're all National Historical Sites. And they're under the protection of the National Park Service. But have you ever heard of, say, the Battle of Salt Run in Virginia?
No.
Well, that's not too surprising, as it wasn't a turning point battle, but it involved several thousand Union and Confederate troops. Okay, now when I came in, I put one of our society's brochures on each of your desks. I want to show you. Just take a look at the cover of the brochure. What do you see?
A shopping mall?
Right. It's called the Salt Run Mall, and it's located right smack in the middle of what was the Salt Run battlefield. Now, take a look inside the brochure. There's a list of almost 400 Civil War battlefields. As you see, these are classified in one of three ways. Do you see what I mean? They're classified as adequately protected, at risk, or lost to development. Only about 70 are adequately protected. About 180 are endangered. You'll find the Ivy Station battlefield on this list. Then there are 150 that have already been developed, that are completely gone. The Salt Run battlefield is on this list, you'll notice.
David, I see you have a question for Ms. Adams.
Thanks, Professor. Yeah, Ms. Adams, I'm just wondering, is your organization, is it made up of reenactors?
Of reenactors? No, not at all. A few members of the society may be involved in reenactment, but not many.
I read somewhere that most of the pressure to save Civil War battlefields, that it comes from reenactors.
Hold on. Who are reenactors?
They're people who pretend the Civil War is still going on.
Well, I don't know if I'd go so far as to say that, but they're people who enjoy reenacting, reliving the Civil War experience. They wear the uniforms of the Northern and Southern soldiers. Some of them have equipment and wear uniforms that are amazingly authentic. And they fight Civil War battles all over again. Without real bullets, of course. And naturally, they prefer to stage these reenactments on the actual battlefields where the original battle took place.
So they're interested in the same thing you are, right?
Well, yes, their goals and ours certainly overlap. Now, personally, I have no interest in spending my weekends dressed up as a Civil War nurse and sleeping in a tent on a battlefield. My interest, the society's interest, is to preserve these battlefields as places of historical, of cultural significance. But several of the reenactment organizations are, well, I guess you'd call them our allies. Yeah, our allies in the fight to save these sites.
I'm just wondering why it's necessary to save all these sites. The big battlefield, sure, but some of these sites are, well, they weren't all that important to the way the war turned out. And, well, they may have been in the middle of nowhere during the Civil War, but now they're on some pretty valuable suburban real estate, and hey, they're privately owned. Can't we just read about these little battles in history books?
I'm going to jump in here, Francis, and comment on what David just said. Geography and topography shape a battle. The patterns of hills, valleys, rocks, rivers, streams, these are all important. And if future historians, military historians, if they don't have access to these battlefields, they won't be able to understand what really happened back in the 1860s.
And I'd just like to add, for those of us who are non-historians, who are not professional historians, well, I think it is important for us, too, that these sites be preserved. If you walk around on a Civil War battlefield and you imagine what happened there, well, you have an emotional connection, an emotional empathy with those who fought there. You can't get that walking around a parking lot. And also, well, I think we owe those soldiers, the ones who fought and died in these places, I think we owe them a measure of respect for their courage, for their sacrifices, no matter how unimportant the battle was to the outcome of the war.
So what does your society do, Ms. Adams, to save battlefields?
Well, one of the things we do is what I'm doing today, making people like you aware, educating people about the problem of disappearing battlefields. And then, as I said, we work with other groups, reenactment groups and historical societies and so forth, to coordinate our efforts. We meet with government officials, state, local, federal, and try to persuade them to buy battlefield land in order to preserve it. And when we can afford it, we buy up land ourselves and keep it free of commercial or industrial development. The Society owns and maintains about 3,000 acres of battlefield land in 7 states.
Well, I'm still of the opinion that you can't really stop progress. Sometimes you shouldn't even try.
Well, David, you're certainly entitled to your opinion, but I can't imagine giving up our own heritage, our own history, without a fight. Anyway, if any of you are interested in joining the Society and helping preserve these sites, personally, I think it's a wonderful idea. I've been a member myself for about 5 years.
Inside the brochure I gave you, there's a form you can fill out if you're interested in joining. There's a special membership for students that's not as expensive as a regular membership.
Now get ready to answer the questions. You may use your notes to help you. Question 1. Why does Ms. Adams mention the Battle of Ivy Station? Question 2. How does Ms. Adams make the class aware of the current condition of the Salt Run battlefield? Question 3. What is Ms. Adams' attitude towards reenactors? Question 4. What is David's attitude toward the preservation of Civil War battlefields? Listen to a lecture in an American literature class.
Okay, for the last few minutes of class, I'd like to introduce you to the poet Emily Dickinson. A couple of days ago, we were talking about the poet Walt Whitman, and if you recall, I said that he was one of the two great voices in American poetry in the 19th century. Today, I'm going to drop the other shoe and talk about the other great poet, Emily Dickinson. The poetry of Emily Dickinson and the poetry of Walt Whitman couldn't have been more different, as we'll see. Dickinson claimed that she never even read Whitman's poems, and their lifestyles, again, couldn't have been more different. But they were both innovators, important innovators, and they both had a major role in shaping American poetry. I said Monday that Whitman became famous all over the country and in Europe as well. He was really the first American poet who was read much outside the United States. Dickinson was well known only in her own small town. In those days, it was just a village, Amherst, Massachusetts. But she wasn't known there for her poetry. Oh, no. She was known for her odd, her mysterious ways. You see, after she finished high school, she went to the Mount Holyoke Female Seminary. Today, it's called Mount Holyoke College, but she only went there for 1 year. She didn't get along with the headmistress, apparently. After that, she returned to her father's house in Amherst, and she hardly ever left. In fact, she hardly left her own bedroom. And when she did leave the house, she always wore white dresses like a bride. Outside of her family, her only person-to-person contact with others was with the children who lived in her neighborhood. This may not seem all that odd to us today, but in Amherst, Massachusetts, in the 1800s, this was considered, well, pretty strange behavior. For a woman who lived such an uneventful life, at least her life was uneventful on the surface, she wrote amazingly perceptive poems about nature, love, and death. Her poems are all quite short and are all untitled. What I like about them the most is their economy. She was able to say so much, to express so much in so few words. She was an extremely prolific poet. Just in 1 year alone, 1874, that was the year her father died, she wrote like 200 poems, but she never wanted her poems to be published. While she did engage in a kind of self-publishing, she assembled collections of her poems in packets that were called fascicles, which she bound herself with needle and thread. There were some 40 of these booklets, but she never tried to have these fascicles published, seldom even showed them to anyone else. She did send a few of her poems to friends and relatives, and somehow 6 or 7 of these found their way into print in magazines or newspapers during her lifetime. You can imagine, though, how she felt when she heard that her poems had been published. After Emily Dickinson died in 1886, her family discovered that she had written over 1,700 poems. Her sister Lavinia edited 3 volumes of Emily's poetry. They were popular as soon as they were published, but it was not until the 20th century that critics recognized her as one of the top American poets. Martha Dickinson Bianchi, the poet's niece, brought out several more books of poems in the early 1900s. Eventually, all of them appeared in print. In 1950, Harvard University bought all of her manuscripts and acquired the publishing rights to all of her poems. Harvard published a complete 3-volume collection of her poems and letters 5 years later. Okay, for Friday, I'd like you to read all of Dickinson's poems that are in our textbook. There are about 20, maybe 25 of her poems in there. But don't worry, though. That may sound like a lot of reading, but it shouldn't take you long. Friday, we'll take a closer look at her poems. Before we move on to another topic, I'd just like to say this. These days, a lot of scholars downplay Dickinson's eccentric lifestyle. They point out that she was not as intellectually cut off as people used to think, that she had a lively relationship with others through her letters, and that she was quite learned about other writers such as John Keats and John Ruskin. But there's no doubt that she lived in relative isolation and that she did not want to be in the public eye. I'm going to leave you with the first verse of one of her most famous poems. I'm nobody. Who are you? Are you nobody too? Then there's a pair of us. Don't tell. They'd banish us, you know.
Now get ready to answer the questions. You may use your notes to help you. Question 5. Why does the professor mention the poet Walt Whitman? Question 6. Why does the professor mention Harvard University? Question 7. Which of the following best summarizes the professor's attitude toward Emily Dickinson? Question 8. How does the professor conclude her discussion of Emily Dickinson? Listen to a lecture in an art history class.
Morning. Today I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about folk art. I know this isn't on your syllabus, but I saw a wonderful exhibit of folk art from the 18th and 19th century at the Hotchkiss Museum over the weekend, and I'd like to share my impressions of this exhibit with you. First off, I should tell you that there's some disagreement in the art world about what is meant by the term folk art. European folklorists, in particular, take the position that folk art must be part of some long-standing artistic tradition. They say it must have been created by artists from a distinct group, say, American Indians, Australian Aborigines, or that it must have been made by people from some particular occupation, say, sailors on whaling ships. These European folklorists would generally not say, they wouldn't categorize pieces made for commercial reasons as folk art. They would also disqualify pieces made by groups, not by individuals. Folklorists in the United States, though, not just folklorists, also museums and galleries, don't take such a narrow view, and I must say, I think the European way of looking at folk art is way too restrictive. Among most American folklorists, they define a folk artist as simply someone who creates art without any formal artistic training. And in the catalog for this exhibit, there's a little essay written by the curator of the Hotchkiss, and he says, "A folk artist is someone who would be surprised to find his or her pieces on display in a museum." That's a definition I like. Anyway, lots of pieces on display at the museum would probably be considered crafts by European folklorists. Some pieces were made by groups, some were even made in factories. For example, the wooden animals for carousels. The exhibit features lots of different kinds of folk art. There are paintings, portraits, and landscapes that were created to be works of art, but most of the pieces have some utilitarian, some commercial purpose. There's furniture, plates and pots, clothing, clocks. There are ship's figureheads, circus carvings, duck decoys, fish lures, lots of weather vanes. Then there's a wonderful collection of trade signs. You know what I mean, don't you? Signs advertising shops, taverns, hotels, restaurants. As a matter of fact, I spent most of my time at the exhibit looking at trade signs. I found them just fascinating, charming. Now, here's something to keep in mind. It wasn't until 1870 that most people in America could read. Signs had to appeal to both readers and non-readers. Sometimes the shape of the sign told you what kind of business was inside. There's a sign in the shape of a tea kettle that was once in front of a tea shop in Boston. A sign in the shape of a pocket watch that was in front of a jeweler's shop. A boot-shaped sign from a shoe store. You didn't have to be literate to understand these. More often, there were painted images. A sign for a blacksmith shop featured a picture of a horseshoe. A bookshop sign showed a picture of a man reading a book. Well, you get the idea. Sometimes the images weren't so obvious. For example, there were signs that pictured an American Indian, a Turkish sultan, an exotic Cuban lady, and a racetrack gambler. All of these images symbolized the same kind of shop, tobacco shops. At the time, people instantly recognized these symbols. Maybe they couldn't read, but they had what's called visual literacy. Visual literacy. These symbols were as meaningful to them, well, just like today. We know we can get hamburgers and French fries when we see golden arches. It was the same sort of thing. Sometimes signs contained political messages. There was an inn in Philadelphia called King's Inn, and its sign showed a picture of King George III on a horse. Well, this was just before the Revolutionary War, and George III wasn't too popular with the colonists. They weren't real fond of him. So the king is pictured on this sign as a clumsy fool practically falling off his horse. Oh, another thing to keep in mind. Back in colonial times, many streets didn't have names, and most buildings didn't have numbers, street addresses. Trade signs served as landmarks. People would say, "Meet me by the sign of the Lion and the Eagle," or "by the sign of the Dancing Bear." If you go to the exhibit and you look at the trade signs, you'll notice that there are almost no plaques that tell you who painted the signs. There are maybe 3-4 sign pieces in the show. The sign painter William Rice of Hartford, Connecticut, was one of the few who signed his work. A few of the signs in the exhibit were done by fairly well-known portrait artists, Horace Bundy, Rufus Hathaway, who made signs for extra money. Their styles are distinctive, and the signs they made can be easily identified. But most of the sign painters, they were mostly itinerant artists, traveling from town to town on horseback, painting a few signs in each town. Anyway, their names have been long forgotten. Well, I want to get back to our discussion of Renaissance art, but I do hope all of you get a chance to see the exhibit at the Hotchkiss. It will be there another 6 weeks.
Now get ready to answer the questions. You may use your notes to help you. Question 9. How does the professor introduce his discussion of folk art? Question 10. Why does the professor mention wooden carousel horses? Question 11. How does the professor explain the concept of visual literacy? Question 12. Why does the professor mention the sign for the King's Inn? Question 13. Why does the professor mention the sign painter William Rice?